Hello, I am V. Welcome back to the Wanderlust Reader, where we talk all things books, learning from them, reading them, writing them occasionally. Today, we're talking about magical realism, and I'm going to be recommending 5 books that I think are magical realism. It's a bit of a funny genre. I'm finding that it's difficult to know where the line falls between magical realism and fantasy. And I have heard it said, controversial point, that magical realism is a way of literarifying the fantasy genre. So people who want to read fantasy but don't want to be considered as genre fiction readers will call what they're reading magical realism. Publishers will market something as magical realism when they don't want to taint it with the fantasy genre name, basically. So that's a controversial point about magical realism. But I tend to think of it as a book that's set in the normal world, but magic is there, or just something unusual is there, something that couldn't happen in our real world, and it's accepted by characters as normal. It's just part of their world. It doesn't cause shock. It's not unusual. It's just there. On that basis, here are 5 books that I think offers magical realism and that I would recommend. The first one is a book that I've recommended before in my mental health recommendations, which I will leave linked up above. I think I'm on the right side. I might be that side. And that is The Astonishing Colour of After by Emily X.R. Pan. This is an absolutely beautiful book. It tells the story of Lee, who is a teenage girl who loses her mother to suicide. She becomes convinced that her mother has become a red bird, and she travels to Taiwan to meet her grandparents for the first time because that's where she believes she will find this red bird. She believes that's where this red bird wants her to go. The narrative completely swept me up into its just sadness and its beauty, but obviously trigger warnings for depression and suicide. The suicide doesn't happen in the narrative, it's about the after effects of it, it's about the characters dealing with what's left behind. Lee just believes that this red bird is her mother, and it's just sort of there in the narrative. And I have seen online some debate about calling books like this magical realism, because in this culture, I suppose Taiwanese culture, it's not considered unusual. People do believe these sorts of things. But I suppose coming at it from a Western perspective, we would call that magic. So I'm not sure. I think of it as magical realism, but I completely understand if somebody disagrees and doesn't call it magical realism. But the writing is beautiful, the story is beautiful. I got completely and utterly swept up in the story. I read it in like 2 sittings, and as soon as I'd finished the books, because I'd borrowed it from the library, I just went out and bought a copy from Waterstones because I needed to have a copy of this in my life, basically. The next one is The Miniatureist by Jessie Burton. The Miniatureist follows Nella Ortman, I think I'm saying that right, as she becomes the new wife of Johannes Brandt in Amsterdam in 1685. She's given a cabinet-sized replica of their house as a wedding gift, and slowly discovers the secrets of both the miniature house and her real one. It's slow. It's a slow-paced book and a bit creepy at the end, but I really enjoyed this sort of, it's another one that's that slow unravelling of a secret as Nella comes to understand this dollhouse, this replica of the house, and how it's impacting on the real world, or how it's connected to the real world. But this is for fans of historical fiction who want something a little bit different, and also if you really do like a good slow story. It's not action-packed, not a lot happens in it. It picks up a little bit towards the end, but it is pretty slow, as literary fiction does tend to be, really. The next book is not a book I have physically, though I will soon have the 1-year anniversary edition of this book, which is absolutely gorgeous, and I'm pretty sure I pre-ordered the signed copy as well. But that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. Addie LaRue tells the story of Addie LaRue, surprisingly enough, who makes a deal with the darkness to live forever. The catch is that everyone she meets is cursed immediately to forget her. She walks through the world as if she's invisible. So we start out following her in the 18th century as she learns to adjust to this new life. And then there's a sort of another timeline running through the book, which is more like a present day timeline, where she finally meets someone who actually remembers her. The only other V.E. Schwab I've read is the Dark Shade of Magic series, which I love. It's one of my favourite series. But this is quite different to that. This borders more for me on literary fiction than pure fantasy. And I think this, for me, is magical realism because in the 18th century, when she makes this deal with this god, devil, dark demon thing, it's just a thing that's happening. And the world is completely normal. The world is carrying on around her completely normally, but she's almost just like this ghost moving through it. And it feels like you could meet Addie and you wouldn't know. She could exist in this world and you wouldn't know. And there's another character gets involved in the sort of supernatural goings on and just sort of accepts it as is. So it does feel, it feels like it fits in the magical realism category for me. But the language in this is really rich. The scenes are just, they're heartbreaking in their beauty. There is such beautiful sadness, is a good way I think of describing it. The next one is another one I don't have a physical copy of. I read this on Kindle, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And this is another one that I was like, is this magical realism? I thought, well, it kind of is. Yeah, I think it is, because it's a very strange little novel. It's quite short. It's a lot shorter than I was expecting, because Susanna Clarke wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a chunker of a book. But this was really short. It's not very long at all. So it's set in the house. Piranesi lives in the house. The house is all he knows. We follow him as he moves through the house, and he meets with the only other person he knows of in the house. And we follow him as the mystery of the house and Piranesi and who he is unravel. It's really quite an unusual story. I have never read anything like it, and I need to find out if the paperback copy is out yet. It's so unusual, and it really did draw me in. I just spent the whole book going, this is weird. Like, this is really weird. And it does come up for me as magical realism, but I can't exactly explain how because of spoilers. Just know that the real world is involved somewhere along the line, and the characters do accept this as just a thing that is. Reader, I would say just read it, just give it a go. And the last one is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This is the only Neil Gaiman I've read. It is about a 7-year-old boy who goes on a strange adventure with the girl who lives at the farm at the end of the lane. It's told from a 7-year-old boy's perspective, as the description indicates. I don't like reading books, really, from children's perspectives. So I didn't rate this very highly, but I think it's a good book. It's about imagination and the borderline between reality and imagination. And again, it feels like magical realism because the characters just, or the character, I suppose, the 7-year-old boy, who part of the narrative is framed by him as an adult remembering this period in his life. So he remembers it, and it's not this thing of wonder, it's just like remembering a childhood adventure. And it feels like this is just part of the world, and not it's not a portal to another world. It's magic existing within our world that is just accepted by this grown man who just remembers this. It is beautifully written, and it does have some lovely nostalgia in it, and it does make you think, at what point do we stop imagining? And I think that's the beauty of being a writer. Just small tangent. I think that is, for me, why I enjoy writing so much, is because I don't get to stop imagining. And I think that's what this book does. And though it's not one of my favourite books, I think it's a good book to read if you don't mind reading from a child's perspective, and you want something that is whimsical. Kind of creepy in points, but whimsical. They are my recommendations for magical realism. Again, it's another one of those genres that I want to read more of. If you know of any other magical realism books, adult or YA, that you love, let me know in the comments. Like if you like, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you next time with another video.